Hello, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to the first interview of the November lineup here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us today is an historian and author making their official debut here on the show. Now, our guest today for the November lineup is an experienced historian with a proven track record of working in both tertiary and secondary education. He is skilled in archival research, lecturing, historical research, academic writing, and social media. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy in History from Queen Mary University of London, and his publications include articles, a book on Anglo-Cherokee relations in the 18th century, and a biography of the Brigadier General John Forbes. His latest work, A History of the First British Empire from 1558 to 1815, was scheduled for publication by Emerly back in 2023 of October. And currently he is focusing on the management of the British Imperial frontier in North America. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I am so happy to have this guest on the show. Let's give a huge round of applause to our first guest of the November lineup, Mr. John Oliphant. John, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Gabriel.
Awesome, John. I am so excited to have you here. Now, for our viewers who are now just meeting you for the very first time, here's a little fun icebreaker question. Is there anything that possibly not a lot of people may know about you?
Native of Australia, now living in Britain.
Ooh, nice. Awesome. Awesome. All right, John. All right. So, in this interview, we're going to be talking about your book, which I am super excited to discuss. Do you have a copy of it that you would like to share with the viewers and give a little overview of what the book entails?
Okay, this is the book. It's Britain's Wilderness Frontier, North American Borderlands between 1748 and 1775, which, as most of your viewers will know, is, of course, the prelude to the American Revolution, or the War of Independence, we want to be precise. And it examines the relations between Great Britain, ministers in Great Britain, and the management of the frontier in North America. So it embraces the Imperial perspective from London, which was complicated in itself. It also embraces the settler perspective, and I should say settler perspectives, because we can't generalize too much, and of course the perspective of Amerindian nations. So the subject's quite complex. I've tried to keep it as readable as possible. The general theme is that the frontier was probably a major cause of the revolution. The British trying to restrict settlement further west.
Yes, which is very, very true, which is absolutely true. And we're going to be diving deep, viewers and listeners, of not just the history behind it, but also the research that went into the creation. The amount of days, I imagine, our guest John went through to really tell this incredible story. So before we get to that, John, let's talk a little bit more about you. So from your bio, you have been writing about history for a very long time, from academic papers, books, and other publications. So I'm very curious, were you always fascinated with history as a child, or did that passion for history and writing about history come a little bit later in your life?
Well, I was always interested in history as a child. I think it was something in the household. Primary school, we had some very dull looking, but actually very good, stimulating history textbooks, which seemed to me to have the best stories in them. Went on to high school. I found I continued to think in that vein, but all that time I thought I was going to do English literature. When I got to university, did my first year, found myself very happy in the history department, not quite so enamored of the English department. And the history department sent me a letter saying, would you like to do the honours course?
Ooh.
I just about flipped. And that's what I did, and I've never looked back. And so from that point onwards, I've been, well, it's been almost an obsession, you would say. And I went
No.
on from there to do a bit of research in Sydney, and I went to London. I got an MA in Imperial and Commonwealth history from an institution called Birkbeck College, which specializes in part-time study. I was very pleased with that. And from there, I found a supervisor to look after my PhD research into the Cherokee frontier during the 7 Years' War. So it snowballs, if you like.
Nice. That's amazing. That is absolutely incredible. So now let's dive a little bit ahead into the creation of this book. So how did ultimately this book come about? Was it based upon like your research, as you mentioned before, about the Cherokee Indians and university, and then just expanded into that? Or did you approach it from a different angle?
Okay, it's a project I've had in mind for some time. In fact, I originally intended to do it on a far bigger scale and with far more extra research. What actually happened was that it turned into a trade book, which is aimed at a general audience, which I think is a very important, what I think is called public history.
Right.
And it was based on the research I've been doing since my PhD days. So it was an awful lot of work I'd done on the Anglo-Cherokee frontier. I'd also written a biography of John Forbes, as you mentioned, and that, of course, turned up all sorts of primary sources, which I made use of in producing this book, which is not for scholarly readers, but for the general reader who wants to be informed.
Awesome. Awesome. So now there's going to be a few fan questions sprinkled throughout. And we're actually going to start with some of the first three. So the first fan question, one of my viewers would like to ask you, John, is when creating this book, did you have an outline that you followed rigidly, or did your outline kind of have a spontaneous nature in the sense of you knew what you were going to write in the beginning, you knew how you wanted to end, but the middle, the main meat and potatoes, the main research, that kind of came about, as the story was unfolding, the story that you want to tell based upon your research?
Yeah, well, that's the latter, really, because although I knew basically what I wanted to say, fitting those different bits together, which I mentioned earlier, was much more difficult than I imagined. So to provide a coherent story which spans the Atlantic, so you've got the London end, what are ministers thinking, what's happening at the American end, what are various settler interests thinking or doing, what are the Indians thinking or doing, that's quite difficult to put together. So the middle, if you like, did actually emerge pretty well as I went along.
All right.
A couple of chapters I knew I wanted to focus on. For example, there's one called Lord Egremont Draws a Line, and that's about the creation of the 1763 proclamation line. I knew what I wanted to say about that. But finding where it would fit in neatly with all the rest was quite a task.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's actually going to be something that we're touching on much later in regards to favorite chapters to write about from your research, and probably ones that were a little bit difficult and challenging to place. So once you had overall the idea of this public history book and the outline, when you began writing it, John, what really surprised you about writing a book for a general audience to then, of course, publish down the road?
Okay. Well, to be fair, my previous book on the early British Empire was aimed at a general audience. And the lesson I learned from that was, although I deliberately designed it to contain a lot of details that someone could pick it up and say, I've got all I need to know about the British Empire up to 1815 here. At least one reviewer and some readers came back and said, well, it's a lot of detail. It takes a long time to get through. So that lesson I took to heart with the current book. I said, well, I mustn't overburden it with dense detail and make it readable in a, if you like, in a more approachable way. So that's what I did. So it's actually a shorter book.
Interesting. All right. And kind of jumping off of that, as not only the historian, but also the author, what was or what is your goal when you began working on this new project? And ultimately, what was your promise you're making, not just to yourself as the historian and the author, but also your prospective readers, either readers who have, come from your first book about the British Empire and new readers just learning about your work through this publication?
Well, I think that the promise was to make it accessible and attractive to as many readers as possible. Obviously, people returning from the British Empire book, but more particularly new people who maybe didn't know much about North America in the 18th century, but are interested because they've got those kinds of minds. I want the people to be able to pick it up and say, this is interesting, I want to read this, and to get to the end of the first chapter and say, I still want to read more.
Nice. That's amazing. That is amazing, John. Now let's talk a little bit some of the main characters, so to speak, of this book. Because during this period, there are some incredible figures during we call like the frontier era, during the 7 Years' War. You have some early founding fathers who are going to play a role. Of course, we get into the American Revolution, one of which, of course, is George Washington, as well as some other figures like Woodes Rogers, who is the commander of the Colonial Rangers, as well as some Amerindian leaders. Of course, you can't talk about the frontiers without the Iroquois Confederacy, which is probably one of the largest indigenous confederacies during the mid 18th century, which is incredible. So when researching when doing the research for this book, what were some of the, or I should say this, who are some of the important historical figures you knew you had to include in your research because they were integral to this part in not only British history, but also American history?
Oh, okay. Well, on the American side, obviously, as you mentioned, the Iroquois and the other major nations, particularly the Cherokee, which I've done a lot of work on, they had to be there, and their leaders had to be there, and they had to be individualized, if you like.
Right.
And of course, on the white American side, people like George Washington, who are prominent figures in frontier expansion, also had to be brought in and treated as ordinary historical figures rather than as icons. And across the Atlantic, there were various ministers. The two most prominent ones, of course, Lord Egremont, mentioned it before, who was briefly Secretary of State for the Southern Department, and Lord Halifax, who first of all had this vision of a more centralized empire with more control over the frontier, and later took over the Southern Department and pushed through the 1763 proclamation. So those are two very prominent figures. The last one, I suppose, on the British side of the Atlantic is Dartmouth, who wasn't involved in the so-called coercive acts, but he did promote the Quebec Act, which of course got included in the Intolerable Acts by default. And the idea was to draw a boundary at the Ohio River, which and Canada would now extend right down to the Ohio, which would prevent American expansionist settlers from getting legal title in Indian lands beyond that. So these are all key figures, and they're all interesting people, and they've all got feet of clay as well as virtue. So I found working with them really exciting.
Nice. This is another fan question one of my viewers wanted to ask you, John, and it's actually a really good one. Ultimately, they ask and rather state that as historians are always looking for research, and something new always pops up that either dismantles a previous held conception about a figure or an event in history, or reinforces it. In your book, John, was there a piece of evidence or a chapter that you worked on that you already knew what you want to write, but when you were doing further research, you realized that the research may have contradicted or further support an idea for a chapter?
Well, if I can come back to Egremont again,
Mm-hmm.
the chapter there I wanted to write was about, well, things I wanted to develop were, first of all, the importance of American frontier and the Indians to ministers in London. And secondly, the fragility and the perceived fragility at the time of the British Empire. It looked very strong. It wasn't really. And ministers were aware that a conflict in North America could very easily bring in a Bourbon combination in Europe, which could be very dangerous to the independence of the United Kingdom itself. So that was an idea I'd put forward in my previous book, and most of the evidence here, and I have to say the work of other historians, drawing it from a lot of secondary sources, obviously, reinforce that notion that it's not a case of an great imperial power exercising its authority willy-nilly, but of a power which actually felt very vulnerable.
Interesting. That's actually very, very true. If you look at the history of the colonial period, the early colonial period in America during like the 1740s, 1750s, it was a kind of like I don't want to say, it was kind of like a boiling point up to in Europe, 7 Years' War, and in the Americas, the French and Indian War. There was tension already. The French were already coming down into the riverlands, already had, of course, tension brewing within the colonists and everything like that. And I guess one of my viewers had a previous question because they did have a chance to look at your book. Does your book focus more so on the events that lead up to what would be the French and Indian War, or do you include the French and Indian War in your research?
Oh, it's French and Indian War is central. So I started in 1748 with and Gabriel, I think you can probably hear the dog in the background.
You're good.
You're okay.
Yeah,
fine. I might just put her into the hall, if you excuse me for a moment.
Let's make note to remove this in post. But before that, you were saying that this book was heavily centered on, or you heavily mentioned the French-Indian War, which you mentioned in 1748 and continues onward. And if you can just further elaborate on that.
Okay. Obviously, it doesn't begin in 1748, but the origins are there. So I thought it was best to start with the Peace of La Chapelle, or if you like in American terms, the gap between King George's War and the 7 Years' War.
Yes.
Because the threads are there. If you start with the 7 Years' War outbreak, then you've missed a lot of the preliminary conditions. And it wouldn't have allowed me to talk about Halifax's ideas, which emerge from 1748 onwards when he became president of the Board of Trade. So, but that said, the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, whatever you like to call it, and whichever dates we choose for that matter.
Yes.
It's got to be central for a number of reasons. A number of historians have said, Fred Anderson among them, of course, that's when the antagonism between the American colonies and Britain became really acute, strangely enough, but because of the direct intervention that was going on, that in London was perceived to be inevitable. And of course, the outcome after the war was over is, of course, the familiar slide towards revolution. So it had to be central. It had to start before 1754 or 1756, whichever one you like, in order to show how that came about.
Yes, very true. Very, very true. And just apologies, John. There's now a glare in my room, so I'm just gonna fix it really quick. I'll be right. I don't have a glare in my face, but that's actually a really good point, John. I like that explanation that you gave because it is really, really true. And I honestly think that that period in, of course, British history and American history doesn't get a lot of scholarship and reach because it is the building blocks of what would be the American Revolution. And that was actually another important fan question one of my viewers did ask, which is, in your research, John, was there anything that you could see that, coupled with other smaller isolated elements, could be the kindling, so to speak, for the American Revolution, whether it's an individual, a certain battle, or an event? And a lot of people here in the States argue that George Washington not getting a commission by the British in the frontier was the stepping stone. And I'm wondering if through your research there are other similar events that also added to the kindling of the American Revolution.
Okay, so Americans getting sidelined, so to speak.
Yes, pretty much.
Washington's very clearly one of them, but I don't think it was so much being denied a commission. He actually refused a commission, Braddock's expedition, because he then would have been junior to technically much more junior British regulars. Even though he wasn't very experienced himself, he thought of himself as a colonel. And Braddock took him along basically as a volunteer. Guy knows the way. And he was happy to do that. What really, I think, alienated people like Washington was the land issue. Yeah, I think I'm not American, and I'm not pinning this on Americans in particularly. It's all frontier societies. I come from one where the supposition is that the land out there is for the taking, and whatever rules and regulations and boundaries imperial authorities might put in the way, we'll ignore it. Washington was certainly of that state of mind, and so was Benjamin Franklin, surprisingly enough. Although he obviously has the image of the gentleman, scholar, and patriot, and so forth. In fact, he's very deeply involved in expansionist schemes. So I think that's the key. That's the key issue, rather than a particular event, which alienates Washington. I think after the war, he's still keen to work with the British governments, provided they wake up to what the empire is really about, which is about continuous frontier expansion. And if there is a moment, my friend Steve Brumwell, in his biography of Washington, notes that as early as 1767, Washington was contemplating armed resistance if necessary.
Wow, so, already that early.
That early. Now, Steve will know the nuts and bolts, but that early he was thinking, well, we want to avoid this. It's a last resort, but if necessary, armed resistance is the answer. And of course, there's already violent resistance going on in the cities. So it's less a particular event, I think, than the imperial perspective versus the frontier expansionist perspective.
Fascinating. That's a really good point, John. Thank you. That's actually really, really good to consider. And that ultimately does go back to what I have talked with other historians who specialize in the colonial period, and specifically the pre-American Revolution America, with so many other avenues. One that I've always really found fascinating during this period, as you mentioned, of course, which is the land expansion, which is another big kind of misconception which I don't know if you cover in your book, maybe you hint at it, is of course a taxation without representation, that being the cornerstone of armed rebellion against the British. But when talking with other historians, it's not really taxation. And as I was talking with them, and maybe of course you do touch on this a little bit and hint at a greater issue, is out of all the colonies Great Britain had, the Americas were the ones that were not paying the same tax as the other colonies, the other territories that the British Empire had. And there was again this notion that because the colonists were able to fight back against the French, albeit with help from the British here and there, they were under the belief that, well, we can govern ourselves, we can take care of ourselves, we don't need the British. And of course, the taxation was not truly as egregious as people make it out to believe. In essence, what people forget, that Great Britain kind of went into debt. They needed to tax, they needed to fill their coffers. And the one colony that wasn't paying the same amount were the American colonies. Therefore, they had to tax. And I don't know if you may cover that in your book, may hint at it, but using that as a stepping stone in terms of like the reviews and like feedback, what was the reaction like from friends and family who were reading it? And did they think of similar notions when they finished?
Oh dear. Well, not too many friends and family were looking at it while it was being created. Um, um, so I think that's a question I can't really answer fully. What I can say is that it's certainly true that the taxation was designed to bring the Americans closer to the level of taxation in the United Kingdom. There was already a stamp tax, for example.
Right.
So if our citizens here are paying it, why shouldn't the Americans? And what you've got opposing that, of course, is this long ingrained tradition of colonial self-government. So, and where the individual colonies were used to running themselves pretty well and ignoring a lot of imperial regulation where it suited them. And here is a government saying, it's about time we actually brought you guys into line. And of course, naturally, it's not going to go down very well, particularly as on the frontier, it prevents people like Washington, for example, of not just asserting their fortunes, but their social status as well.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
So I think you probably know Washington got out of tobacco at this time because the bottom was dropping out of the market, and he was spending money like mad that he didn't really have in London. And the way around that was to replant wheat, but to also acquire land, Indian land, for sale or rent to small farmers. So he was basically a land speculator. So if you put those two together, this tradition of running our own affairs and the imperial government saying you can't take more Indian land, you've got a pretty explosive mixture there.
Yes, absolutely. Very true. Very, very true. And this goes into another question, more so of being a writer, which I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on, John. And I'm wondering if you also encountered this when writing your first book. And that is, of course, as authors and as writers, we're always going to have days where we are not going to write or we cannot write. Even if we have all the information, we know we want to write, we just can't. And it's the dreaded writer's block. For you, John, how did you overcome that in your first book and now this book?
Well, in my first book, which was actually my PhD thesis published, I suppose I overcame it by pushing the boundaries back. At one point, my supervisor said to me, "When are you going to finish? I want to retire." Which was a fair enough question. So I took rather longer over it than I might otherwise, my excuse being that I had a full-time job at the time. And I suppose on a smaller scale, what I would do is put down the pen, put away the computer, go out and do something else. go for a walk, for example. I do a lot of hill walking, or I did a lot of hill walking. And that clears one's mind quite a lot. So go away, do something else, read something else, go for a walk on the South Downs, look at the beautiful views, forget about North America for a bit, or deadlines.
Nice. That's good. That's good. As authors and just as people, we need little fun things to just, clear our mind and clear our head and just enjoy. And as I've talked with a lot of other people on the show, just taking a step back really does wonders. And now we're going to go into other series of questions, reflective questions, which I'm very eager and keen to hear your thoughts on, John. And the first one is, of course, what does it mean to be an author and an historian in the digital age? Because the industry as an author and the field of history has greatly changed in the last 20 years. Social media has definitely changed up the game, for better or for worse, depending on how you look at it. And it's incredible to see how integral social media is in terms of promoting one's book, promoting one's research and everything like that, as well as history. Social media being used as social media being used as a platform to showcase and promote history. But it's a double-edged sword. There's going to be some good moments, there's going to be some bad moments, some good interaction, some horrible interaction. And social media is very, very draining. And for me, myself, I'm not a very social media person, even though I have a few platforms. I try not to be on them as much, and it can be very exhausting to keep up with the engagement. So for you, John, being in the digital age, what has that meant to you as a writer and as an historian?
Well, I'll take you through the 20 years if you like. I remember my supervisor saying to me over a beer, he's saying, you need to buy a word processor. That's where we were. You need to buy a word processor. What? Which I did. And in terms of sources, of course, hardly anything is online. You have to go to it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, an awful lot of journeys around. Now, of course, not all sources are online. You've still got to go to archives. You've still got to move around a lot if you're doing primary research. But an awful lot is suddenly appeared online. And the big gift that I found is the George Washington papers.
Ooh.
They're being digitized. Fortunately, a library I belong to has a subscription, so I can use them whenever I like, and they're there. So that's one trip across the pond. Doesn't need to happen at all. So that's a gift. As for social media, I hate it. I resisted it very much up to the point of this book, and I realized probably I hadn't pushed the last book enough on LinkedIn and Facebook or whatever. So I made an effort with this one, and it does seem to pay off. People pay attention. So although I'm not a natural self-advertiser, I tend to get quite embarrassed at the idea of pushing my own stuff, but it just seems to be that in the modern age, that's what you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
For my last book, the publicity officer, Philip Dean, gave me a whole list of places he was sending the book to. How's that for a start? There are about 100 destinations on that list. I thought, this is great. I'd leave it up to him. And I didn't do very much myself. Approached a couple of bookstores, see whether they would give me an event, and they didn't. And I left it at that. The lesson I learned was, get over your embarrassment, John. So that's the pressure from social media. But there are also some research benefits coming from digitization, which I think are great. I was sent digitized material from an archive in the United States.
Right.
Which they had microfilmed and then digitized, and they were quite happy to share that. So that's That's a bit of effort and expense saved. So there's some progress on the research side, although it's not as much fun as going to an archive. It's much more convenient.
Mhm.
On the social media side, yeah, I'm afraid it's become compulsory, more or less, if you want to be noticed. And I do want this book to be noticed because it's written for a wide audience.
Absolutely, very true. And that kind of goes into the next question, which of course is networking. And I would say among the positive aspects of social media, the ability to network has greatly boomed in the last 20 years. We're able to connect with a wide range of fellow historians, fellow authors, fellow writers, and that is amazing. And from those connections, we learn, how do we market our book? How do we approach the research, anything like that? It's absolutely incredible. So, John, are there any people you would like to give a shout out who have helped you on your journey as an historian and as a writer?
Oh, from social media, less from social media than people I've encountered doing research in the past. I mean, I mentioned Steve Brumwell a couple of times. And I
Mm-hmm.
met him in Los Angeles at the Huntington. And I first saw him walking along a footpath. I thought, who's that guy? Who's that funny guy there with the baseball cap? And I was introduced to him, and he turned out to be from Sheffield.
Ah,
He was researching a groundbreaking book on the British Army in North America. It's one of those books you probably have the same experience where you pick it up and you think, I wish I'd written that. So it was that sort of quality. So that has been useful from time to time. On social media, as I said, haven't really sort of been engaged in social media for that long. So it's more personal encounters like that that have helped. Well, with you being the exception, of course.
nice. Well, thank you, John. Thank you for that. And now we're going to go into my favorite segment, which is the business side of being an author and being an historian. So, John, we're also going to touch also on your first book as well in connection to this. So, as an author, when you were publishing your works, your books, what really surprised you about the marketing aspect of being an author? And looking back, is there anything you would have done differently in terms of promoting your books?
Oh, quite a lot, in fact. The big mistake I made with the John Forbes biography was to give the wrong answer to a question asked by the editor at Bloomsbury Academic. And she said, are you sure you want us to publish it? We could send it to the trade branch. I said, no. So I imagined it as a kind of crossover book. I said, no. And she said, I think this is all right. We'll do this. And they published it. And I was surprised at the price they put on it and at the lack of publicity.
Mm.
The lesson I learned from that was, if you go to an academic press, don't expect them to go for a wide audience. And of course, they knew their own business best. They were publishing for libraries principally. But I could still see the look on the face of one of my friends in Pennsylvania who looked at it and he said, I can't afford this.
Oof.
So that was partly why I looked around and I found Amberley, who do books for a wide audience at a reasonable price. So I'm sorry,
right.
I'm not dissing Bloomsbury too much.
No.
Playing with academic presses. But by contrast, though, surprisingly, I have to qualify that because my first book was published by Palgrave, which used to be Macmillan Academic, and that sold 1,000 copies in rapid fashion.
Nice.
What I put that down to is that it was publicized properly in the United States, and it was a United States market kind of book. It was about the Cherokee frontier.
Right.
But then it got to a point where that market was saturated and it stopped. So I'm looking at Amberley as a possible home, and anything I write in the future will be, even if it's aimed also at scholars, will also be aimed at a wide audience.
Nice. Very, very nice. And this goes into another question, which I think is important to ask because as academics, we have been trained to write in a certain style. We have been trained to write very analytically and use academic wording for our dissertations, for our essays, for our theses, and what have you. But talking with a bunch of other authors who have written or who have aspired to write for academic press, there is this distinction of, okay, if we are going to write, we have to understand that A, not everyone's going to pick up on the jargon that we are going to know. And secondly, who are we writing this for? Are we writing this for the academic community or for a general audience? Because that is going to determine if that's going to help the book succeed. So, as you said, John, you wanted this book in particular to be accessible for a general audience. How did that affect the writing in the sense of you wanted it to be academic, you wanted it to be very, very well researched, but you didn't want, again, to be too overly researched that it could throw off a prospective reader and confuse them with the jargon?
Well, I've always been against jargon. I hate jargon, and when historians start using jargon, somebody once said it's to prove we're actually a mainstream academic discipline. So I tend to write in an accessible style anyway. I like that. I find it more enjoyable. That's one thing. Second thing is an analytically structured book is fine if you're going for a particular kind of academic audience.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going for a wide audience, or you simply want to tell the story, narrative is absolutely essential.
Yes.
So what I always wrestle with is how can I combine this research and depth of thought with an accessible narrative? And that's what I've tried to do at different levels. I tried to do it with my PhD thesis, which became the book.
Yes.
Some people said, well, you've got too much detail in the way, it's obfuscating. And rereading it, I'd agree with them, actually. I think with the John Forbes book, I did much better to combine those two things. So I had a story to tell. This is the man's life. This is why it matters. This is what's interesting about him and his friends. This is what it reveals about British society at the time, the British Army. And I enjoyed that thoroughly. I loved it. Wasn't able to do it quite as well. I don't know. I think I probably did it quite fairly well with the Empire book, but that, of course, has got a much more complicated canvas because you've got to cover several continents and the British Isles, and get a narrative in. So what I did, I deliberately structured that so someone could come to the first section and say, well, I'm really only interested in the 16th, 17th centuries. I'll just read that first bit. And you've got an overview and you've got the various geographical locations. On the other hand, oh, well, I'm not really interested in India or West Africa or West Indies. I want to read about mainland North America. There'll be a chapter in each section on that, or chapters on that. So someone could actually follow that through. And the same would be true for India, West Indies, and so forth. So it's a much more complicated narrative. But I thought it was very important to have a narrative in there. So A, there's an enjoyable story there. B, someone who doesn't know the ground can see how things developed.
Right.
Without having to go off and look at the different analytical chapters, which may just puzzle them. So I suppose in sum, I enjoy writing narrative. I enjoy combining it with research, and I enjoy trying to make it work.
Very true. And another fan question one of my viewers asked is there another era in history that you would like to explore or another historical figure you would like to bring to light?
Oh, heavens. Well, I've dug myself in pretty well to the 18th century British Empire. There's a lot around that I'd like to get into if I had the time and the expertise. In particular, the British conquest of India. I think the British conquest of India. Now, lots of people with far greater expertise in that because that's their specialty. I was helped along. You asked about people who helped me along in the past. One of them was P.J. Marshall, who was very prominent in the scholarship from the Indian subcontinent as well as the wider empire in the 18th century. And so people like him are just formidable. But I still can't help feeling I would like to know a bit more about, say, the misdeeds of Clive of India and how the British actually managed to acquire authority over a continent, but they're actually a tiny minority.
Yes, that is true. That is very, very true. If I can also make a suggestion, possibly as a starting point, it's a fiction book, but there's definitely a lot of research in there. It is, if I can remember, if it's close to me, it is, where is it? I gotta find it. It is actually Simon Scarrow's The Generals. And that book looks at a young Napoleon and a young Duke of Wellington. And it actually focuses on their two biggest achievements in their early military careers. Now, for Napoleon, that is, of course, the conquest of Egypt. So you do learn about his other battles in Italy and the Holy Roman Empire and Austria-Hungary. But Egypt is like the focal point of that story. But also the second part of that is the Duke of Wellington, where you see him and his forces engaging with the Indian rulers, the various Indian rulers of the Indian subcontinent. And you definitely see what would be the conquest of India in the 1790s. So if you did decide to pursue that, John, I would definitely find that book, The Generals by Simon Scarrow, and definitely use that as a jumping off point, especially because there's a lot of research in there that you could definitely use.
Well, thank you for that. I enjoy reading Scarrow. He's a very readable writer.
He is. He absolutely is. And speaking again of being writers, this leads into probably three important questions, which I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on, John. And I'll give context for this, which is, as writers and authors, we love to write. We love to tell stories, whether that's academic stories, whether that's history stories, or fiction stories. But regardless of what you write, it has to come to an end at some point. And sometimes writing the end or the endings is the most daunting and challenging, because you have to know when to stop writing, if it's truly finished, and if the ending that you've landed on is engaging and well worth it. So for you, John, how did you tackle each of those three aspects? Knowing when to stop writing your book, knowing when the book was finished, and ultimately knowing that the ending that you've written through research as well as narrative wise was going to be satisfying for the reader.
Yeah, the ending is always difficult. And in history, of course, you can follow themes onward forever. So I had to be very disciplined from my point of view in stopping in 1775. Once you get into the War of Independence, that's a whole can of worms. That's far too much to cope with. So it has to be manageable. Has to be manageable. So the ending has to be in a manageable place. My first book ended in 1763. Could have ended later. And later on, when I looked at it and read a couple of reviews, which were friendly reviews, I thought, yeah, maybe I should have gone on a bit further. But it seemed like a natural place to end then. With this one, of course, 1775, it's a no-brainer. You come up to the beginning of the revolution, You've got the situation there. You've got the Amerindians. You've got the expansionists. You've got the British desperately trying to draw a line in the sand, and everyone knows that it led to a war. So I thought that was obviously the place to stop. And with Forbes, of course, it stops with his death, which is a well, with biographies, of course, your subject determines more or less where you stop because they're no longer around.
Right, absolutely.
So yeah, I enjoy trying to find a place where the reader will say, "Hey, that's a nice, satisfying ending." Although I can see places where the story could continue.
Nice, very, very nice, John. And we now arrive at the final two questions of this amazing historian and author interview. And they go as follows, John. With everything that we talked about in this interview, from your background in history, your journey as an historian, as well as finding your voice as a writer and balancing the academic with the narrative style, ultimately, what do you want people to take away from this book about the frontier empire of the British Empire? And secondly, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors, especially those who want to write about history, whether that's fiction or going the route of academic or for a general audience?
Right. Well, with all my work, what I want people to take away from it is that history is not a question of blacks and whites. It's a whole shade of greys, and it's about weighing up the different factors operating, and not starting, of course, with moral judgments, goodies and baddies, blame and blame or praise. You can arrive at those later, of course, but that's what I wanted people to take up from it. And I always used to say to my students, the very best history book ever written was Siller and Yateman's 1066 and all that. I don't know whether you know it. You don't know it?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
It was a spoof. It was sent up of certain kinds of history education and the way people remember their history, written in 1934. And it's still in print and it's still true. And it's a hoot. Because what it does is it basically pillories a particular kind of British history, which is about Britain as, quote, top nation. And the very last sentence in it is, and so America was clearly top nation and history came to a full stop. So it was that kind of attitude. You know?
Oh, man.
And they say in the introduction, it's history is not what happened in the past; it's what you can remember.
Ooh, that's a good statement. That is a very good statement.
A lot of popular historical perspectives are about remembering bits and not knowing the whole story or not caring about the whole story. What I want my work to do is to leave the reader thinking, well, that's a lot more complex than I thought it was. It can be followed, it's clear, but it's the certainties aren't really there quite as strongly anymore. And if I can bring that across, well, I'd be happy to be paired with Siller and Yateman, but I'm not as funny.
Awesome. And ultimately, what is your advice to fellow historians and fellow authors?
Oh, read Siller and Yateman.
All right.
Read Siller and Yateman, and you'll see the more history you know, the funnier it gets, and the more you realize there are all sorts of misconceptions out there that need to be shifted, and it's our business to shift them in as objective a way as possible. So I guess that's right. Read Siller and Yateman. Be detached. Don't write for a cause.
Ooh, all right. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude the first ever interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. Want to give a huge thank you to our guest, John Oliphant, for making his official debut here on the show. John, thank you so much for coming on the show. Greatly appreciated. where can people find you on the interwebs if they want to reach out and connect, as well as purchase a copy of your books?
Okay. Well, I'm on both Facebook and LinkedIn, where people can find me fairly easily, I think. And purchase a copy of the books. I think it's in the United States. It'll be available in January.
All right.
Amberley's distributor will deliver books to bookstores about that time, and I think Amazon actually says the 20th of January.
Okay.
So you can do that. If you really want to pay good money, you can get them sent across the Atlantic, but that's expensive. So I would recommend waiting until January and getting it through Amazon or a local bookstore.
Excellent. I will attach all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another incredible interview here on the show. And before we officially end, I do have a special announcement. Two, in fact. I am now accepting advanced readers, or say ARC readers, for my book, Decimus, The Wolf of Rome, which is now available for pre-order on Amazon, which I'll attach the link down below in the description of this video. And if you are interested in being an ARC reader, I will attach the application link down as well. And I cannot wait for it to be released. It will be releasing this Christmas on the 24th. So if you would like to read Decimus, you can pre-order now. Or if you'd like to read the books before Decimus, I will also attach those down below. Or you can go to my website, wanderingscribe.com, or look for them on Amazon. The books are The Gathering and Son of Persia. And until next time, thank you, everyone, for joining us for the first episode for the November lineup. A huge thank you to John for coming on the show. We wish him the very best with his books and his research and everything for the rest of this year and for 2026. And until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you all in the next episode.